The boardroom lights flickered like they knew what was coming. Carter stood at the head of the table, smiling like a king who'd already won the war. You arrived 7 minutes late on purpose. Let the silence stretch just long enough to ripple discomfort across their suits and tablets. You shook his hand. Firm grip. Dead eyes. You knew he'd briefed the others already. You knew he thought the trap was sealed, the narrative airlocked. CEO destabilized, stock confidence eroding, time for new leadership. They'd rehearsed the coup like a script, confident the last act was already in motion. You didn't say a word during the budget walkthrough. You nodded, let them speak in polished falsehoods. You watched Madison fidget with her earpiece, watched Lena from compliance avoid your eyes. Every one of them had signed something they didn't read. Backdoor proxies masking Carter's embezzlement as performance pivots. The signal came through at 10:37 a.m. A vibration on your wristband, low, coded. Lane's upload was complete. Years of surveillance, voice captures, backroom transcripts, all dumped into a silent dead server you'd named Antigone. You'd built it for this very outcome. They thought they buried Lane. They didn't know he wore a wire the night. They popped champagne over your inevitable restructuring. That footage was longer than the one sent to your wife. This one didn't end with the toast. It rolled deeper, into Carter's plan to auction off proprietary tech to one of your biggest rivals overseas, to stage a breach, to frame you for it. It even caught the exact moment Madison laughed, called you finished, and lifted her glass with the words, "Let's burn the house." You'd seen enough. So you flipped the board meeting. Quietly, subtly. You announced a new due diligence, partnership, an internal ethics audit under the pretense of ESG compliance. You named Lena as its head. She nearly choked on her water. The trap was now yours. You spent the next week feeding data to Antigone. You made sure every keystroke was cross-synced to a vault no one knew existed, except you and the ghost of Lane. The recordings grew darker, more intricate. Carter's conversations with legal counsel, where he forged HR complaints under the names of junior staff. Voice clones used to simulate your orders, even deepfake prototypes. Rushed, bad resolution, but damning if leaked. You knew what they wanted. To fracture your legacy, extract the tech, and sell the bones. Your silence had made them bold. They thought the audit would come too late. But you launched it 3 weeks early, under the guise of a leak assessment. You embedded a security firm already on your payroll under a false name. You made sure Carter welcomed them personally. The walls began to shift. Whispers circulated through departments. Carter scrambled to realign his scapegoat timeline. Lena asked for time off. Denied. Madison tried to clean her laptop. Too late. You'd mirrored her files since the day she sold you out. In a bar downtown, you met with Lane. His eyes were sunken, face paler than you remembered, but his voice was iron. "They think they invented the game," he said, "but you built the board." You passed him a burner. One task: schedule the leak for the annual investor summit. If the timing was perfect, the firm would hemorrhage 23% of its value in a single hour. That was the point. Shock therapy. They thought they were playing chess. You were rigging the ceiling to fall. In the quiet of your office, you stared out at the skyline. Each light in each building told a story. Some of betrayal, others of quiet compliance. You didn't hate them for turning. You pitied them for forgetting who you were. The final surveillance file landed in your inbox that night, titled only Requiem 2 Vid. You pressed play. It opened with Carter alone in a glass conference room, practicing his speech. "I didn't want to do this, but the company needed protecting." He lost control of the vision. He paused, repeated it. "They'll see I had no choice." You watched him rehearse your execution like an actor gunning for awards. not knowing he was already surrounded by rot of his own making. They thought, the storm wasn't real. That thunder was just your presence. They never knew you were the storm. And soon, the house would burn from the inside out. You walked into the office at 5:04 a.m., earlier than anyone, earlier than even the janitorial crew. The security guards looked up, startled, but said nothing. They'd seen the late nights, the early mornings, the weeks you practically lived here. You made sure they saw. That silence was your ally now. They thought you were losing sleep over fear. You were building a reckoning. The audit's internal dashboard glowed blue in the dim light. Each folder that pulsed open was a coffin. Carter's hidden equity transfers, Madison's comms with rival firms, Lena's authorization stamps for wire payments that never passed compliance. You didn't rush. You watched the numbers move. Let them climb like pressure in a sealed pipe. You sent a single file, just one, to the firm's general counsel. No message. Just the time-stamped conversation where Carter, in digital crystal clarity, discussed creating false breach logs and linking them to your ID. You knew the GC wouldn't call. He wouldn't email. He'd forward it straight to the audit committee. He had a family, a yacht, a reputation. He wouldn't go down with a captain steering straight into the iceberg. The signal came through again. This time, a still image. A photo of Madison stepping into the same unmarked car used by Convergent Tech Solutions. Your largest competitor. The same group that had bid against you in Berlin, lost, and then tried to replicate your prototype a month later. Poorly. They weren't just buying your stolen tech. They were buying the collapse. The enemy wasn't just inside your firm, it was your firm. You deployed the pressure protocol at 9 a.m. 3 flagged memos, 2 anonymous HR complaints, 1 external breach simulation, all within an hour. You watched the panic unfold from the 34th floor. The board scrambled. Compliance lit up. Madison vanished from her desk. They thought it was all coincidence. They didn't see your hand on every lever. That afternoon you walked into the server room alone. No cameras, no monitors. Just the hum of machines that had kept your empire alive. You plugged in a drive and let Antigone replicate itself, twice. One to the cloud under Lane's off-grid credentials. One to a secondary location tied to a public Dropbox on a journalist's burner. It was never about protecting the company anymore. It was about detonating it in a way that left no survivors who profited from your crucifixion. You sat with Lane one last time. The final failsafe was ready. Time it to the earnings call, you said. Mid-sentence, he nodded. They'll never see the floor drop. 3 hours later, in the war room, Carter stood before the top partners. He paced like a man high on his own script, like a man who didn't know his lines had been rewritten. You watched from the corner, quiet. Lena kept glancing at you like she expected you to collapse. Instead, you smiled. You leaned forward and whispered to her. Check your inbox. She opened the email. 1 file. 1 second of silence. Then everything began to unravel. First, the board chair's phone buzzed. Then Carter's. Then half the room. The audit portal crashed, overloaded by a flood of encrypted packets. The leak had triggered every alert protocol in the firm, every flagged document, every manipulated signature, every forged memo, all at once. Carter froze mid-pitch, eyes wide, voice gone. You stood up. I suggest everyone read very carefully. The next 20 minutes decide who walks away and who doesn't walk at all. Madison entered the room, late, pale, her phone still in her hand. You knew she'd seen the broadcast. You'd linked the leak to every employee's inbox. scheduled to open during the call. You walked past Carter as he finally reached for his seat. He didn't speak. Couldn't. They thought they were still in control. But the trigger had already been pulled. And the dead hands on it belonged to ghosts they'd buried. The building shook, not physically but reputationally. It would spread fast. Wire services, journalists, investors. Algorithms would catch the keywords: fraud, conspiracy, espionage, insider manipulation. And your name? Absent. Just as you planned. The empire was bleeding out in front of its king. You didn't even look back. You were in the boardroom when the call came, voice shaking like glass. Your wife never called during deals. Especially not like this, with raw panic slicing through her breath, telling you to come home now. You stepped out mid-presentation, left the touchscreens flashing quarterly projections behind you, and walked into a storm that had started long before today. The skyline blurred behind tinted windows as the driver cut lanes. You knew the panic wasn't random, it was timed. They thought they had hours before you'd uncover what they'd built beneath your life. You'd been watching them longer than they realized. Still, you hadn't planned on today. The front doctor was ajar when you arrived. The air inside was too still, like the house had paused to listen. You called your wife's name once, twice, and then found her sitting at the dining table, phone in hand, hand trembling. On the screen, a video, played. Security footage, private, not from your house. You watched in silence as a meeting unfolded in a high-rise lounge. Your face was absent, but theirs weren't. A circle of smiles, champagne, and betrayal toasted to the smoothest hostile ousting the firm's ever pulled off. At the center, Carter Quinn, your co-founder, your supposed right hand. You didn't speak. You rewound it. Watched again. Your wife said only, "They sent this to me. From an anonymous number. 30 minutes ago." You sat down slowly, pulse steady. You knew then, this wasn't a betrayal. It was a play. The first move had just been made. The footage was 3 nights old. The timestamp aligned with your trip to Munich. They thought you'd never see it. They thought you'd be blindsided when the board convened next week and voted you out, citing performance concerns and breaches of discretion. But you'd already seen the documents they'd forged. You'd seen the shadow payments rerouted through shell vendors. You'd seen your own signature copied across memos you never wrote. The signal came through again. Another message, this time just coordinates. GPS pings. A warehouse in Red Hook. You left your wife with a single nod. No words. You knew what you'd find before the door even closed behind you. Inside the warehouse, cold light hummed from fixtures overhead. Lining the walls were server racks, burners, backups, proxies, mirrors of your firm's internal system. Someone had cloned the infrastructure and scrubbed the evidence. Someone had prepared for a digital erasure. The server logs were messy, not to your standards. They'd done a half job trying to mask who accessed what. But you saw it, clear as blood on glass. Carter, the night before Munich, logged into the core drive, exporting confidential models. Proprietary tech you'd developed. The tech that underwrote your entire valuation. You knew now. Carter wasn't working alone. Back in your office that night, you rerouted the audit triggers you'd embedded 6 months earlier. You had prepped them when the tension first changed. In the boardroom, when the jokes got too smooth, too rehearsed, and the eyes stopped meeting yours. They thought you'd been too quiet. That was their mistake. Your silence made them think you were weak. They thought you didn't notice when your calendar was quietly adjusted by Madison, your executive assistant turned Carter's mole. They thought you never saw the backdoor VPN Carter's team installed to access R&D sprints in real time. They thought you hadn't seen the offshore accounts opened in your name. You fed those accounts with exactly what they expected: false IP, dead patents, synthetic client data. You let them believe they were bleeding your legacy dry. The signal came through one last time that night. This time, a voice message. Your wife wasn't supposed to see that, but it's time. End this. You recognize the voice. Dorian Lane, former chief risk officer, fired quietly 2 years ago after he resigned. Carter had buried him, but Lane had kept receipts. You slept 2 hours that night, just enough to calibrate your next move. By sunrise, you had every keystroke mapped, every silent betrayal archived. In the mirror, you adjusted your cufflinks. They would never see you coming. The room smelled of antiseptic and betrayal. Machines blinked like nervous liars, and your daughter, sunken-eyed, fragile, breath like wind through broken blinds, reached for your hand and whispered something no child should ever say. She asked to see your back. You lifted the sheet, and your breath cracked like glass. Raised ridges, old welts, bruises that had no place on a body so young. They were mapped in a pattern, too symmetrical, too deliberate. And beneath one shoulder, blade, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, was the faint imprint of a corporate tag. You knew then that this wasn't an accident or malpractice. It was a message. They thought you had faded after your last failed deal, had gone soft when you walked away with nothing but your daughter and silence. They didn't know you had kept everything. Every file, every camera angle, every encrypted whisper saved, under ghost identities. The police officer staggered when you showed him the photo. He asked where it came from, how it was burned into skin. You said nothing, just looked at your daughter and saw 20 years of espionage carved into her body. They thought you'd stay quiet forever. They forgot you designed the very encryption, protocols they tried to bury her under. They didn't know you had been waiting for one final confirmation, and now it was branded in flesh. The signal came through 2 days later, wrapped in code and grief. It unlocked a server farm in Zurich, buried under 6 layers of legal fog, and inside it, patient logs, project trials, and a list of test subjects with your daughter's name at the top. Every piece pointed to a single name: your former protégé, the one they promoted after forcing your exit. You knew this wasn't personal at first. It was business. But the moment they touched your bloodline, it became war. They had turned your child into an experiment, just to blackmail you into silence about the billion-dollar defense AI you had designed before they stole the rights. They thought your absence was surrender. It wasn't. It was positioning. A soft knock at the hospital window came the next night, and behind the glass was a courier with no face in the system. They handed you a drive with no return address, no data trail. You recognized the metal casing, proprietary casing from a project only 4 people ever worked on. Inside was a video. Your daughter, years younger, strapped to a table in a lab with your former assistant whispering commands. A company logo shone in the corner, and in the background, the boardroom voices toasted to finally removing the emotional liability from our primary target. The recording had timestamp overlays you recognized, because you'd built them. You had left markers, silent watermarks on every system you ever touched. You'd warned them once in a line of code they never saw. You're being watched by the one you discarded. Now it was time. You didn't call a lawyer. You didn't threaten. You simply made a copy of the file, buried it inside a fake patient's folder on the corporate insurance portal, and set the trigger. When her heart rate crossed a certain threshold, everything would be released. To regulators, to news outlets, to enemy stakeholders. They'd forgotten what you were. They thought your daughter was a mistake they could erase in silence. The boardroom lights flickered 2 states away that very moment, like they knew what was coming. They toasted your retirement, 3 years ago, with fake applause and a corner office you never stepped foot in. They toasted her silence with lab-grade sedation and falsified records. And now, the toasts were done. One more thing you buried beneath her bed. A secondary biometric token keyed to your own retinal scan. Just in case. You sat beside her as machines hummed and the window fogged with dawn. You watched as the colors of morning turned the room pale and bruised. You counted the beeps, each one echoing the sound of an empire cracking. The lights in the emergency bay dimmed just before midnight, the same way the lab lights had gone out the night you signed your final resignation. Your daughter stirred in her sleep, the biometric coil beneath her ribs glowing faintly, and across the city, a dormant firewall pulsed alive for the first time in 6 years. The signal came through her vitals, an exact code sequence you'd hardwired into her bloodwork after that night they took her. You knew they'd never think to look for your comeback inside a dying girl's bloodstream. They assumed your grief made you blind, but it only sharpened your aim. You knew how they worked, how they covered tracks by deleting not just files, but people. They thought you'd buried the servers in grief, but grief was just the encryption key. The Zurich files unlocked more than trial data. They unraveled an entire shadow ledger. Hidden subsidies, false donations, off-site clinics, all signed with an alias that matched a ghost identity you'd abandoned years ago. You traced every node back to one source: the Ascendant Protocol, your stolen neural simulation AI, now weaponized and embedded inside medical systems across global markets. You never needed to hack them. You were the source code. They thought scrubbing your name erased your legacy, but you knew the real signatures were invisible, nested inside the architecture like a scar you never speak of. And when your daughter's breathing hit 98 BPM, those signatures began to unlock. You watched from a cold hospital chair as the night shift nurse excused herself, then never came back. She wasn't a nurse. You recognized her from a redacted footage file, back when she still worked internal risk analysis for the board. You smiled as you followed her retreat through the hallway cameras. Her badge pinged the west stairwell, but she never made it past the 2nd floor. Somewhere in the sub-basement, a secure room's light turned red, then black. The servers blinked, and halfway across the world, a boardroom projector froze mid-presentation. Lines of code spilled across their quarterly report slides: names, payments, timestamps, patient IDs. Then your name appeared, then your daughter's, then your assistant's, then came the video. You knew they'd watch it in disbelief. The straps, the cries, the branding tool. You'd slowed it down just enough to make their horror stretch into minutes. You'd layered in a background heartbeat, your daughter's, so it could never be mistaken as footage from a stranger. They thought they had wiped the footage after the patient relocation. But you'd mirrored every frame into a quantum cache embedded in a fail-safe node under a defunct satellite project. The screen went black again. Then a new message appeared in white text. I remember everything you tried to erase. The boardroom froze. But you were already moving. You sent the second packet, quietly, discreetly, to a competitor firm under the name Samael Grant, a name they would never trace back to you. The competitor was hungry, ruthless, and owed you a favor from another. War you'd won in silence, inside the file. Patent violations, contract breaches, and the AI neural interface patent still legally registered under your ex-wife's maiden name. A detail they never noticed because they never believed she mattered. You'd predicted their every move, right down to which board member would suggest wiping the servers. But you'd already infected the backups. The data wasn't just leaking, it was multiplying. You knew they'd try to run it through the scrubber systems, reassign blame, trigger internal PR alerts. But the moment they accessed the Zurich files, they triggered a recursive algorithm that embedded itself in every report, every investor message, every single memo that bore your assistant's digital fingerprint. He'd built his empire on your bones. Now it would collapse on his. They thought silence meant weakness. But you learned long ago that silence was camouflage. You